Okay, so let's continue the setup of our spine by looking at our shoulder controls. We're going to have an attached shoulder control that's going to move with our hips. It's going to be parented underneath our hips. We're also going to have a detached shoulder control that will exist in master control space. That will be parented underneath our master control. We're going to blend between these, and we're going to use the result of that blend to drive the top part of our spine, along with the linear interpolation eventually of those other spine controls. Now, we're not going to worry about the linear interpolation of those controls in this video. We're also not going to worry about the spine twist of the bones in this video. We're also not going to worry about matching our attached control to our detached control and vice versa in this video. They're going to be coming up over the next series of videos. In this video, I'm only concerned with creating the controls, blending between the controls, and using the result of that to drive the top part of our spine. We'll then go ahead and get some of our rig for our arms that was created back in character rigging 1, get some of that now attached in to the rest of the spine so that all of the rig that was created back in character rigging 1 is now attached in to the rest of the rig that we've been building. So let's start out by creating a null that's going to act as the initial position, if you will, for our shoulder control. So I'm going to branch off of our hip control into a new null. And I'm going to position this at the top of the spine, right around where the shoulders are. So I'm going to jump into a front view with space 3, and translate that null in the front view up to right around the top of the spine. So right around the top of the spine. Fantastic. And this is going to act as the initial position. So it's not the control itself, it's simply the initial position. And the reason for this, for those of you who joined us in character rigging 1, you saw that when working inside an asset, when we're trying to match controls, we need to use a workaround whereby we're going to have another null that exists in the same space, if you will, as our control object. And we'll discuss this when we come up to it again in a few videos' time. However, it's a lot easier if our nulls don't have pre-transforms, and thus their pre-transform, as opposed to being existent on a pre-transform, is really a parent null that holds that initial positional information and rotational information if necessary. So we're going to create that null that acts kind of like a physical pre-transform rather than a pre-transform embedded in the node, and that just makes it easier for us to create two different nodes that exist in the same space. They're both with no pre-transform and no transformation parameters parented into our null that acts as that initial position. They're going to exist in the exact same space, and that's going to work out fantastically for us later on. So that's why I'm using a null to act as an initial position, as opposed to creating a control and using its pre-transform to hold that initial position information. So we've got this up here at the top of our spine. I will go ahead and move this on up to the top of our spine, and I'm going to rename this to our shoulder underscore hip control parent underscore initial position. And let's turn off the visibility and selectability of that node. We can now wire into a new null, and this will actually become the shoulder control that is parented underneath our hip control. So I'm going to wire into a new null, and this is going to become our shoulder control underscore hip control parent. So I'm going to give this a blue node color since it is a control object. I'll give it a yellow wireframe color since we're dealing with a control object in the center of our character. I want to set this up as a circles control with the orientation set to the ZX plane. If we jump into the perspective view with space 1, I want to boost our geoscale up. Something right around 10 will work out nicely for us. So this is going to act as our attached shoulder control. So let's go ahead. We know that our shoulder control can be moved. It's going to be able to be rotated. I am going to lock scales, pivots, and uniform scale. So we got that control in place. So let's duplicate both of these nodes, Control C and Control V, to duplicate these and set up our shoulder control for the master control parent. So I'm going to rename these accordingly. So this is going to be shoulder underscore master control parent underscore initial pos. And this will be shoulder control underscore master control parent. Let's take that shoulder underscore master control parent underscore initial position, keep position when parenting, and parent this in instead of our hips to our master control. You'll notice it won't jump in the view, but that now means that we have one control object which exists in our hip space and one control object that exists in our master control space. So if we grab our hips and move them, one control object will come along, the other won't. So that's now going to give the animator the ability to decide, do we want our shoulders to be acted as if they are a child of our hips, or are we working on some kind of motion where it's easier to think of these as two separate items and moving our hips? Say if we were moving our hips in a circular motion but wanting to keep our shoulders and our feet in line, it would be very hard if our shoulders were parented into our hips. So we're setting this up in such a way that we have the ability to either attach our shoulders to the hips or detach them to the hips. Now, talking of attached and detached controls, following on from a color convention that I set in the first character rigging DVD, I'm going to color our detached controls a orange color. So I want to jump onto our master control parent for the shoulder control and change that wireframe color over to an orange. And that's just to follow that convention that I've already started, so an animator can see when dealing with this rig in particular, if they see a control object that's orange, they know, hey, that's the detached control. If they're dealing with a control object that's any of the other colors, they know that that must be an attached control. Based on the color of that control, they then know which part of the rig that belongs to, whether it's the left part, the right part, or the center part of our rig. So we've got our two control objects. We need to blend between these. So I'm going to right click on the output of our shoulder control underscore hip control parent and wire that into a new blend object. I'm also going to take our shoulder control master control parent and wire that into our blend as well, renaming this to blend shoulder control. Now we don't have anywhere currently to set up our parameters for setting up our parameters for these control objects and for their blending. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new digital asset, and that's going to be to hold our parameters for dealing with blending back and forth between these controls. It will also hold our scripts for matching those controls. It will hold a couple of other things, and you'll see that when we come to adding these to it. For now, it's only going to hold the blend parameter for these controls. So I'm going to create a new subnet, which will eventually become our asset. So let's push tab to bring up the tab menu. Just wait for Houdini to come back to life. There we go. I'm going to create a new subnetwork. Now I did push S without the tab menu open and change the layout in terms of my wires, but that's fine. I just push S a couple of times, push that back to what it was originally. So we've got a subnet. I'm going to rename this subnet to our dynamic control parenting. Now eventually this will become the shoulder dynamic control parenting, but since this is going to be an asset that we're later going to reuse on another part of this rig, I'm going to name it just dynamic control parenting to begin with, so that our asset comes in with that name rather than our asset coming in and specifying shoulder. So let's right click, and I'm going to create a digital asset from that node. I'm going to rename this to dynamic control parenting. Let's open up our folder. From inside my hip file, I'm going to jump inside the OTLs folder. These are OTLs we created back in Character Rigging 1. I'm going to rename this to Dynamic Control Parenting.otl. And as mentioned back in Character Rigging 1, you have the option here of creating all your assets within this single OTL file for our Goblin character. I'm taking the approach of putting them in separate OTL files, so that if for whatever reason at a later date we wanted to use this on another character in the same project or another project entirely, we do have the option of taking that OTL and just that OTL on its own, rather than taking the entire character and having to install that character. So just for the ability of quickly coming in and grabbing another OTL file, I am creating these as separate OTLs on disk. So let's accept that and accept. This is going to bring up our type properties window. On the parameters tab, I don't need the transform and subnet parameters that come along with our assets. I am going to make those invisible, but I'm going to create a new folder for our new parameters, and this will be named Dynamic Control Parenting. And inside this folder, I'm going to create a float parameter for our blend. So I'm going to create a float for our blend parameter, and I'm going to name this attach to detach blend. So that means that when we're set to a value of 0, that means we're going to be fully blended to the attached control. That's the control parented to our hips. When we're set to a value of 1, we're going to be fully blended to the detached control. That's the control that is attached to our master control. I do want to lock this between a range of 0 and 1, since we only want to go between 0 and 1, and we can go ahead and accept that to create that asset and create that parameter on our asset. So let's link up this blend parameter to the weights on our blend shoulder control. So I'm going to go ahead and specify for weight 1, since we want this to be a value of 1 when our blend value is 0, and a value of 0 when our blend value is 1, I want 1 minus that blend parameter. So let's jump up, grab dynamic control parenting, and go ahead and grab the blend parameter. Now let me just scroll this over so that we can indeed see the entirety of that. So there we go, I'm grabbing dynamic control parenting and the blend parameter 1 minus that parameter. If we accept that, I can now scroll that back along, we'll see we're currently set to a value of 1 since that parameter is set to 0. In the second weight, I only want the dynamic control parenting / blend. So I only want, let's bring that up in expression editor for a second, the blend parameter on its own as opposed to 1 minus that parameter, since when we're set to 0 I want a weight of 0, when we're set to 1 I want a weight of 1. So you'll see now that our weights are going to blend back and forth. The easiest way to demonstrate this is to grab our detach control, slide that out, and take a look. We can just about see our blend there existing as a small spherical object in the center of the currently attached control, and we can blend between those two, and you're going to see that blend object slide back and forth between the two. So I'm going to grab our detached control, zero that back out to its default location. I'm going to rename our asset now that it's been created, since I'm only going to be renaming this local instance of it to shoulder dynamic control parenting. And whilst we're here, let's deal with the visibility of our controls. We know if we're dealing with attached and detached controls that if we're set all the way to a value of 1, then we're completely detached. It would make sense to have only the detached control visible and to make our attached control invisible. In the same way, when we're set all the way to a value of 0, it would make sense to have only our attached control visible and make our detached control invisible. So because of that, let's link up our display parameters on both of these controls and link them to that blend parameter. So this is our detached control. That means I want this visible all the time that that blend parameter doesn't hit a value of 0. All the time the blend parameter is greater than 0, that means that we are in some, even if it's a small percentage, in some form of percentage influenced by that control. When we hit 0, we're not at all influenced by that control, so we can turn off its visibility. So I'm going to say the display is equal to our shoulder dynamic, and this is going to be a fairly lengthy expression, so let's bring it up in the expression editor. Shoulder dynamic control parenting, and I want the blend parameter on there, and I want to say as long as this is greater than 0, I want to see that control. You notice because it is actually set to 0 currently, we don't see that control. When we set to a value greater than 0, that control becomes visible. In the same way, let's jump over to our hip control parented version of the shoulder control and set its display equal to that blend parameter, so shoulder control dynamic parenting / blend, and shoulder control dynamic parenting / blend, and set that to if it's greater than, or sorry, if it's less than a value of 1. So if we accept that, we see that control because it's less than a value of 1. As soon as we hit a value of 1, that control should, I believe I've obviously referenced that parameter incorrectly, so that's shoulder dynamic control parenting. That's why. Instead of shoulder control dynamic parenting, it is indeed shoulder dynamic control parenting / blend is less than 1. So if we accept that now, there we go. When it's equal to 1, the control disappears. As soon as we're less than 1, that control appears. So now we can blend the visibility along with the position and orientation of those controls. So I will set the detached control back to its rest position over here. I'll also turn off the visibility and selectability of our blend object. So I want to wire that blend object into a null that's going to act as a reference for the result of that blend, and the real importance of that node is going to become more apparent in later videos, but I am going to wire it into a null that I'm going to name shoulder control blend result. So I'll wire that into a null, and let's name that to, move that out the way, name that to shoulder control underscore blend result. And I'm going to turn off the visibility and selectability of that control as well. Now, this particular null, which is the blend result, needs to control the top of our spine. So I want to parent in both spine control 5, the very top control, and spine control 4, the next one down. And that will give us just that little bit of control over the orientation of the end of the spine, as we mentioned before, along with positional control over the end of the spine. So I'm going to grab spine control 4 and spine control 5, and let's bring those up to where we're working. We're leaving controls 1 through 3 for when we set up our interpolation of those controls later on. So let's grab controls 4 and 5. I want to keep position when parenting, indeed that's already checked, and parent that in to the blend result of our shoulder control. Let's turn off their visibility, turn off their selectability, and also set their node color back to a value of gray, since they are no longer animator controlled control objects. So with that in place, if we grab our attached control and were to move our attached control, we'll see that we'll take the top of the spine with us. We're currently set to have a lock spine. If we jump down and unlock our spine, there we go, we can see that this will bring the top of our spine with us. If we rotate this control, it will give us some control over the orientation of the top of our spine. Just a very small amount, but it's better than having nothing at all. So it will give us some control over the orientation of the spine. More than that, we can come in, grab our detach control, move that over here, and if we blend between these, we can see our spine blend between those two controls. Fantastic. So we do have a few parts of our rig that we still need to hook up to the spine of our rig that relate to our shoulders. That's going to be the shoulder position controls. They are the two controls that deal with positioning the shoulders. It would make sense to have those as children of our shoulder control. So if we move our shoulder control, these two controls that position our shoulders come along for the ride. So currently they position our shoulders, but if we move our shoulder control, they don't come along. It would make sense for this control to control the shoulders as a whole, which means we want to take both the R shoulder position control and our L shoulder position control, keeping position when parenting, parent those into the blend result of our shoulder control. So I'm going to blend that into shoulder control blend result. We do need to go ahead and clean those transforms, so this becomes the rest position for those controls. Now if we move that control, we're going to see that it is bringing our shoulders along for the ride. The only other part of our rig, if we were to grab our master control and move it, you'll see the clavicles, apart from obviously the controls on our spine, the only part of our old rig are the clavicles, and they are being left behind. We need to attach those in to our spine. So I'm going to attach those to the end of the top of our spine. To do that, I'm going to find spine bone 5 and wire that into a new null. And I'm going to name this null, let's just move that out to the side. I'm going to name this something like spine underscore bone. Actually, I was going to name it spine bone 5 underscore M position, but since we're going to be attaching our clavicles and our shoulders to this, I'm actually going to give this the name of shoulder attachment. Just, changing my mind on naming on the fly there. So I think shoulder attachment makes a little bit more sense. And we want to go ahead and set the translations here to a negative, and it's going to be our spine underscore bone 5 length. So I want to grab a negative of our spine bone length, taking us to the end of that bone. We can now parent underneath this null both of our clavicle bones, and that means they'll follow along with any changes in position and orientation at the end of the spine. They will follow along with. Let's turn off the visibility, selectability of that node, and let's get our clavicles parented in whilst keeping position. So we're going to get our clavicle root for both L and R, making sure they do have keep position when parenting set, and I'm going to parent those in to our shoulder attachment. And you can see now, if we were to grab our shoulder control, that is going to move the entire upper part of our rig Now it is leaving the IK handles behind as Houdini thinks about doing something. There we go. It is leaving the IK handles behind. That's fine. We know that they are parented underneath our master control. If we were to grab our master control and move it, you're going to notice, yes, our spine controls are left behind. Currently, they're not set up, but the rest of the original rig is coming along now with us. So that's working out fantastically. So with that, that is going to conclude this video. In the next video, we'll take a look at beginning the setup on those 3 spine controls. Thanks a lot, everyone.